The war had been going badly for the Galactic Alliance for 3 standard years when the humans arrived. Commander Zethkar remembered that day with crystal clarity, though he wished he could forget it. The transport ships had emerged from hyperspace like metal whales breaching an ocean of stars, their hulls scarred and patched, their engines burning with an aggressive blue flame that spoke of modifications no engineer would recommend. Zethkar stood on the observation deck of the Alliance flagship Eternal Harmony, his 6 arms clasped behind his back in the traditional Kethmori pose of contemplation. His species had been the backbone of the Alliance military for over 2 millennia, their natural discipline and 4 centuries of lifespan making them ideal career soldiers. The Kethmori understood war the way poets understood verse, with an appreciation for its rhythms and rules. "Sir," came the voice of his aide, Lieutenant Vexene, her voice carrying the musical tones characteristic of their species. "The human delegation has requested permission to dock." Zethkar's main eyes remained fixed on the approaching vessels, while his auxiliary eyes turned to regard his subordinate. "Humans," he repeated, tasting the unfamiliar word. "These are the ones from the Outer Rim? The newcomers?" "Yes, sir. They've been in space for less than 2 centuries. Their technology is primitive by our standards." Through the transparent aluminum viewport, Zethkar watched as the human ships drew closer. They moved with an odd confidence, their formation loose but somehow purposeful. Most species flew in precise geometric patterns, their ships maintaining exact distances according to mathematical principles developed over millennia. The humans flew like a pack of wild animals, each ship aware of the others but free to move as instinct dictated. "They claim to have fought the Devourer fleet?" Zethkar asked, referring to the nightmare that had been systematically consuming Alliance worlds for the past 3 years. The Devourer fleet was an ancient enemy, older than recorded history, that emerged from the void between galaxies every few thousand years to feed on civilized worlds. Their technology was beyond anything the Alliance could comprehend, their ships capable of consuming entire planets and converting the matter into new vessels. "Yes, sir. They claim to have damaged several Devourer ships." Zethkar's 4 primary eyes narrowed. In 3 years of warfare, the Alliance had managed to destroy exactly 0 Devourer vessels. They had damaged perhaps a dozen, but the enemy ships seemed capable of regenerating from almost any injury. The Alliance's strategy had devolved into delaying actions and evacuations, trying to save as many civilians as possible before each world fell. An hour later, Zethkar found himself in Conference Room 7, facing the human delegation. He had read the preliminary reports, but seeing them in person was somehow different. They were smaller than most sapient species, bipedal with an almost fragile appearance. Their skin was soft-looking, lacking the natural armor or protective scales that evolution had granted most spacefaring races. Their leader, a female who introduced herself as Admiral Sarah Chen, had gray streaking through her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. "Commander Zethkar," she said, pronouncing his name with only a slight accent. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us." Zethkar gestured with 2 of his arms in the formal greeting of his people. "Admiral Chen, your arrival is unexpected. Our intelligence reports indicated that human space was in the Outer Rim, far from the current theater of operations." Chen's lips curved upward in what Zethkar recognized as a human smile, though something about this one seemed predatory. "It was. The Devourers hit us 6 months ago. They took 3 of our worlds before we figured out how to fight back." "Fight back?" Zethkar's auxiliary eyes focused on the human while his main eyes studied her companions. There were 5 humans in total, all wearing uniforms of dark blue fabric with minimal ornamentation. Their technology was indeed primitive by Alliance standards, their weapons appearing to be simple projectile throwers and energy devices that would have been cutting-edge perhaps a century ago. "The Devourers have technology far beyond our understanding," Zethkar continued. "Their ships repair themselves, their weapons can pierce any shield we've developed, and their hulls are composed of some form of programmable matter that adapts to whatever we throw at it. How could you possibly damage them?" Chen's smile grew wider, and Zethkar felt an unexpected chill run through his system. "You've been trying to fight them like they're just another enemy fleet, haven't you? Using conventional tactics, conventional weapons?" "Of course. What other approach would one take?" One of Chen's companions, a younger male with scars across his neck, leaned forward. "Commander, with respect, you're thinking like a civilized being. The Devourers aren't civilized. They're more like a virus. And sometimes, to fight a virus, you need to think like one." Zethkar's translator struggled with several words in the human statement, but the general meaning was clear and deeply unsettling. "I'm not certain I understand your meaning." Chen activated a holographic display that showed a tactical readout of a star system. This was the Kepler system, one of our newer colonies. Population about 3 million. The Devourers arrived here first. The display showed massive ships emerging from hyperspace, their organic-looking hulls pulsing with dark energy. Standard Devourer tactics, Zethkar observed. They disable orbital defenses, then begin consuming the planet's mass to build more ships. Exactly. And for the first day, that's exactly what they did. Our orbital platforms were destroyed in the opening hours. Our fleet was scattered. By every measure of conventional warfare, we had lost. Chen touched a control, and the display zoomed in on the planet itself. But humans don't always fight conventional wars. The display showed the planet's surface, where millions of lights were moving in coordinated patterns. "What are those?" Zethkar asked. "Cars," said the scarred human. "Trucks. Personal vehicles. We had about 40 million of them on Kepler. Most people use them to get around on the planet's surface." Zethkar was confused. "I fail to see the relevance." Chen's smile had become something that made Zethkar's 3 hearts beat faster. "Tell me, Commander, what happens when you fill 40 million vehicles with high explosives and coordinate them using a distributed network?" The realization hit Zethkar like a plasma bolt. His primary eyes widened, while his auxiliary eyes swiveled to stare at each human in turn. "You didn't?" "We did," Chen confirmed. "The Devourers landed their harvesting ships to begin consuming the planet. Their shields are designed to stop energy weapons and kinetic rounds from space. They're not designed to stop 40 million guided missiles approaching from the planet's surface at ground level." The tactical display showed the results. Thousands of small explosions bloomed across the surface of the planet as the improvised missiles struck the Devourer harvesting ships. The enemy vessels, each the size of a city, staggered under the coordinated assault. The explosions themselves didn't do much damage, the scarred human continued, but they did something more important. They overloaded the ship's adaptive systems. See, Devourer technology learns from each attack and adapts. But when you hit them with 40 million simultaneous attacks, each one slightly different, their systems can't process all the data fast enough. While their systems were frozen trying to adapt, Chen added, we hit them with everything else we had. Nuclear weapons, antimatter charges, and... She paused, her smile becoming even more unsettling. Some other things. Zethkar found himself leaning backward in his chair. In 4 centuries of life, he had never felt quite so disturbed by a military briefing. Other things? Well, said another human, a female with prematurely white hair, we may have weaponized some things that most civilized species would consider off-limits. Such as? The humans exchanged glances. Chen shrugged. Biological agents designed to corrode their hull material. Quantum viruses that infect their computer systems. Nanoscale machines that replicate using the enemy's own resources. She paused. And then there's the psychological warfare. Psychological warfare? Against machines? The Devourers aren't just machines, Chen explained. Our xenobiologists believe they're a fusion of organic and artificial intelligence. They can be confused, frustrated, even frightened under the right circumstances. How do you frighten a species that consumes planets? The scarred human's grin was absolutely terrifying. You make them think you're crazier than they are. You attack in ways that don't make sense. You sacrifice things no rational being would sacrifice. You make them believe that fighting you will cost them more than any victory could possibly be worth. Chen activated another display, this one showing the aftermath of the Kepler battle. We lost the planet, of course, but we cost the Devourers 6 harvesting ships and delayed their operation by 3 weeks. More importantly, we proved they can be hurt. Zethkar stared at the display, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The humans had sacrificed an entire world and 3 million of their own people to damage the enemy fleet. No Alliance species would have considered such a strategy. The cost was too high, the sacrifice too great. You're insane, he said quietly. Chen's expression became serious for the first time since the meeting began. Yes, Commander, we probably are. The question is, do you want our insanity fighting for you or against you? The conference room fell silent. Zethkar found himself studying the humans with new eyes. They were small, fragile-looking creatures with primitive technology and a disturbing tendency towards self-destruction. But they were also the first species in 3 years to inflict meaningful damage on an enemy that had seemed invincible. What exactly are you proposing? He asked. Joint operations, Chen replied. Your ships, our tactics, your resources, our creativity, your civilization, our barbarism. And in exchange, we help you turn this war from a fighting retreat into something else entirely. Zethkar activated his personal communication device and sent a coded message to his superiors. The response came back within minutes, authorization to proceed with preliminary cooperation. "Very well," he said, "but I want to observe your methods firsthand before I commit Alliance resources to them." "Of course," Chen agreed. "In fact, we were hoping you'd say that. We have a mission planned for next week. A Devourer scouting force has been spotted near the Vega system. We're going to discourage them from proceeding further into Alliance space." "How?" Chen's smile returned, and Zethkar realized that he was beginning to recognize the expression. It was the smile of a predator that had found particularly interesting prey. "Oh, Commander," she said, "you're going to love this. We're going to show the Devourers something they've never seen before. Something that will make them think twice about advancing further into our territory." "And what would that be?" The scarred human leaned forward, his own predatory smile matching his admiral's. "We're going to show them what happens when humans get bored with conventional warfare." As the meeting concluded and the humans filed out, Zethkar remained in his chair, staring at the tactical displays. He had the distinct feeling that he had just agreed to something that would change the nature of the war entirely. Whether that change would be for better or worse remained to be seen. But for the first time in 3 years, he felt something he had almost forgotten existed. Hope. Even if that hope came wrapped in the terrifying realization that there were things in the universe more frightening than the ancient enemy that consumed worlds, things that smiled when they planned to commit acts of warfare that would horrify civilized species. Things called humans. The preparation for the Vega operation began immediately, and Zethkar quickly realized that humans approached warfare planning differently than any species he had encountered. Where Alliance strategists would spend weeks analyzing enemy patterns, calculating optimal force deployments, and developing contingency plans for every possible scenario, the humans seemed to operate on a combination of careful research and barely controlled chaos. Admiral Chen had assigned him to work directly with Captain Marcus Rodriguez, the scarred human who had spoken during their first meeting. Rodriguez's ship, the Defiant Spirit, was a modified heavy cruiser that looked like it had been designed by someone who had read about proper spacecraft engineering but had decided to ignore most of the recommendations. "The thing about fighting the Devourers," Rodriguez explained as he led Zethkar through his ship's corridors, "is that they expect certain responses to certain stimuli. They've been doing this for thousands of years, maybe longer. They've seen every conventional tactic, every standard formation, every by-the-book strategy. The ship's interior was a maze of exposed conduits, jury-rigged modifications, and equipment that Zethkar couldn't immediately identify. Human crew members moved through the narrow passages with practiced efficiency, but their uniforms were mismatched and their equipment appeared to be maintained through willpower and improvisation." "So we don't give them conventional?" Rodriguez continued. "We give them something they've never seen before. Something that doesn't fit their database of known responses." They entered what appeared to be a laboratory, though unlike any scientific facility Zethkar had ever seen. Workbenches were covered with devices that seemed to serve no identifiable purpose, and several humans in lab coats were working on projects that made Zethkar's auxiliary eyes water just to look at them. "Commander," Rodriguez called out, "meet our Chief Science Officer, Dr. Elena Vasquez." "Elena, this is Commander Zethkar from the Alliance. Doctor." Vasquez looked up from a device that appeared to be violating several fundamental laws of physics. She was a middle-aged woman with prematurely gray hair and what humans called glasses, primitive vision correction devices that somehow made her look more intelligent rather than less. "Pleasure to meet you, Commander," she said, wiping her hands on a cloth that seemed to absorb more dirt than it removed. "I hope you don't mind a bit of creative engineering." Zethkar examined the device she'd been working on. It was roughly spherical, about the size of his torso, and covered in what appeared to be crystalline growths. "What exactly does it do?" "Well," Dr. Vasquez said with the same unsettling smile that seemed common among humans, "that's a bit complicated to explain. The short version is that it makes Devourer ships think they're somewhere else." "Somewhere else?" "The Devourers navigate using quantum sensors that can detect the underlying structure of space-time itself," Rodriguez explained. "Their technology is sophisticated enough that conventional jamming doesn't work. But Elena here figured out how to make their sensors detect quantum signatures that don't actually exist." Dr. Vasquez nodded enthusiastically. "I call it a reality displacement bomb. When it goes off, every Devourer ship in the area will think they're in a completely different star system. They'll see planets that aren't there, detect threats that don't exist, and try to navigate using stellar references that are light years away." Zethkar felt his 3 hearts begin beating in an irregular pattern. You're telling me you've developed a weapon that alters the enemy's perception of reality itself? Oh, that's just the beginning, Vasquez replied cheerfully. Wait until you see what we've done with their communication systems. She led them to another workbench where a device that looked disturbingly organic was pulsing with a soft blue light. This little beauty hijacks Devourer communication networks and injects them with what we call cognitive malware. Cognitive malware? Ideas, Rodriguez said simply. Bad ideas. Contradictory orders. False memories. Philosophical paradoxes that their artificial intelligence systems can't resolve. Zethkar stared at the device. You're attacking their minds? Their digital minds, yes. The Devourers use a form of distributed consciousness across their fleets. Each ship is connected to every other ship through quantum communication links. We figured out how to use those links to introduce inconsistencies into their thought processes. Dr. Vasquez picked up a tablet and showed Zethkar a series of diagrams. For example, we can make a Devourer ship believe that its mission is to protect the worlds it's supposed to consume. Or we can introduce recursive logic loops that cause their targeting systems to attack themselves. Yesterday, I managed to convince a Devourer probe that it was actually a toaster. A toaster? A small appliance for heating bread, Rodriguez clarified. The probe spent 6 hours trying to make breakfast before its systems crashed. Zethkar had to sit down on what appeared to be a crate of unknown materials. In his 4 centuries of military service, he had encountered many forms of psychological warfare, but nothing quite like this. How do you even think of such things? The 2 humans exchanged glances. Well, Dr. Vasquez said, humans have a long history of fighting enemies that were bigger, stronger, and better equipped than we were. We learned early that if you can't beat someone in a fair fight, you change the rules until it's not a fair fight anymore. Plus, Rodriguez added, we're really good at thinking of ways things can go wrong. Most species try to build systems that work perfectly. We build systems that work well enough, and then figure out how to break everyone else's systems. They spent the next several hours touring the ship and meeting with the various department heads. Each human Zethkar met seemed to specialize in some form of warfare that violated conventional wisdom. The weapons officer had developed projectiles that didn't explode on impact, but instead released swarms of microscopic machines that would eat through enemy hull material. The communications officer had figured out how to turn Devourer ships' own sensors against them by broadcasting signals that would cause their detection systems to see phantom threats. The most disturbing meeting was with Lieutenant Commander Sarah Kim, who served as what humans called a psychological warfare specialist. The thing about the Devourers, she explained as they sat in her cramped office, is that they're ancient. They've been doing the same thing the same way for millennia. They expect resistance to follow certain patterns, and when it doesn't, they become agitated. Frustrated. Sometimes even frightened. Lieutenant Commander Kim continued, they're used to enemies who fight to win or fight to protect something or fight for honor or territory. They don't know what to do with enemies who fight because they enjoy fighting. Zethkar's primary eyes focused on her intently. You enjoy fighting? Kim's expression became thoughtful. Not exactly. But humans have this thing we call spite. When someone hurts us, we don't just want to stop them from hurting us again. We want to make them regret having hurt us in the first place. Revenge? Revenge is about getting even. Spite is about making sure that even if we lose, the enemy doesn't win anything worth having. She activated a holographic display that showed tactical data from previous engagements. Look at this battle from 6 months ago. A Devourer fleet attacked one of our agricultural worlds. Standard tactics would be to evacuate the civilians and make a fighting retreat. What did you do instead? Kim's smile was genuinely terrifying. We evacuated the civilians, but we left behind something special. We had modified the planet's agricultural nanomachines, tiny robots that help crops grow, and programmed them to infect Devourer ships. To what end? The nanomachines don't damage the ships directly. Instead, they gradually alter the ship's internal atmosphere to make it more suitable for growing earth plants. After a few weeks, any Devourer ship that landed on that planet starts sprouting wheat and soybeans in its corridors. Zethkar stared at her. You turned their ships into gardens? It gets better. The modified plants produce pheromones that are harmless to humans but cause severe disorientation in Devourer neural systems. Plus, the plants are designed to be extremely difficult to remove. They integrate with whatever materials they're growing on. So their ships become unusable for anything except farming, yes. The Devourers had to abandon 3 ships from that fleet. They're still floating in space, completely overgrown with Earth vegetation. The tour continued with visits to other departments, each one revealing new and creative ways the humans had found to make warfare unpredictable. The engineering section had developed tools that could cause enemy ships to spontaneously develop aesthetic preferences, leading them to redecorate their interiors rather than fight. Medical Bay had been converted into a biological warfare lab where scientists worked on pathogens that would make Devourer ships believe they were experiencing various fictional scenarios. As the day progressed, Zethkar began to understand that human warfare wasn't just about destroying the enemy. It was about fundamentally altering the nature of conflict itself. Where most species fought to achieve specific objectives, humans fought to ensure that fighting them would be such a bizarre and unpleasant experience that enemies would actively avoid engaging them in the future. It's called asymmetric warfare, Rodriguez explained as they sat in the ship's mess hall, consuming food that Zethkar found surprisingly palatable despite its alien origin. When you can't match an enemy's strengths, you attack their weaknesses. When you can't attack their weaknesses, you create new weaknesses. When you can't create new weaknesses, you change the fundamental nature of the conflict until their strengths become irrelevant. And if that doesn't work, Rodriguez's expression became serious. Then you make sure that defeating you costs them more than any victory could possibly be worth. The conversation was interrupted by an announcement over the ship's communication system. All hands, prepare for hyperspace jump. Estimated time to Veda system, 18 hours. As Zethkar made his way to his assigned quarters, he reflected on what he had learned during his day aboard the human ship. The technology was indeed primitive by Alliance standards, but it was being applied in ways that no Alliance engineer would ever consider. The humans had taken the limitations of their equipment and turned them into advantages by using them in combinations that defied conventional logic. More disturbing was the realization that human tactics weren't just unusual. They were actively designed to be traumatic for the enemy. Most species fought to win quickly and efficiently, minimizing casualties and collateral damage. Humans fought to ensure that even thinking about fighting humans would become an unpleasant experience. In his quarters, Zethkar activated his personal communication device and composed a report for Alliance Command. How could he explain what he had seen? How could he convey the scope of human creativity when it came to warfare without sounding like he had suffered some form of mental breakdown? After several attempts, he settled on a simple statement. Humans possess unconventional tactical capabilities that may prove effective against Devourer forces. Recommend proceeding with joint operations while maintaining careful observation of human methods. As he settled into his sleeping alcove, Zethkar found himself wondering whether the Alliance was making a deal with a valuable ally or a dangerous predator. The humans were clearly effective, but their methods raised questions about the nature of civilization itself. Outside his porthole, the stars began to shift and blur as the ship entered hyperspace, carrying them toward what would either be a brilliant tactical victory or a demonstration of why some forms of warfare were too dangerous to unleash, even against an enemy like the Devourers. In 18 hours, Zethkar would learn which category this mission would fall into. He was beginning to suspect it might be both. The Vega system appeared on the tactical displays like a 3-dimensional map of impending doom. Zethkar stood on the bridge of the Defiant Spirit, watching as sensor readings painted a picture that made his 3 hearts beat in complex counter-rhythms. The Devourer scouting force was larger than expected. 7 ships instead of the anticipated 3, each one the size of a small moon and pulsing with the characteristic dark energy that marked their kind. Well, Captain Rodriguez said with the casual tone humans seem to use when discussing matters of life and death, this is interesting. Admiral Chen's voice crackled over the communication system from her flagship, the Indomitable Will. Rodriguez, what's your assessment? 7 ships, all heavy scouts. They're in a standard reconnaissance formation sweeping the outer system methodically. At their current pace, they'll complete their survey in about 6 hours. Zethkar studied the formation with his auxiliary eyes while keeping his primary attention on the human crew. In any normal military situation, a force this outnumbered would either retreat or call for reinforcements. The humans had brought only 5 ships to face 7 Devourer vessels, and their technology was still centuries behind their enemies. Admiral, Zethkar said into his communication device, perhaps we should consider withdrawal and await additional Alliance forces. Chen's laughter was audible over the comm system, and it was not a sound that inspired confidence in conventional military thinking. Commander, you're thinking like someone who wants to win a space battle. We're not here to win a space battle. We're here to win something much more important. Which is? We're here to win the war, Rodriguez said, his fingers dancing over control surfaces that looked nothing like any ship interface Zethkar had ever seen. Elena, are your toys ready? Dr. Jadovit? Vasquez's voice came from the laboratory section. Reality bombs are armed and ready. Cognitive malware is loaded into the delivery system, and I've prepared something special based on our intelligence about Devourer psychology. What kind of special? Well, Captain, you know how Devourers are essentially hive minds that share consciousness across their entire fleet. Yes. I've developed a virus that will make them all experience intense nostalgia for things that never happened. Zethkar's translator struggled with the concept. Nostalgia for things that never happened? False memories of a golden age that never existed? Dr. Vasquez explained cheerfully. They'll become convinced that their current mission is somehow corrupting their pure and noble past. It should cause significant internal conflict. Rodriguez activated the ship's tactical display, which showed the positions of both fleets in real time. The Devourer ships were moving in a complex pattern that would bring them into contact with each human vessel within the next 2 hours. All right, people, Rodriguez announced to his crew. You know the drill. We're not trying to destroy them. We're trying to traumatize them. Remember, the goal isn't to win this engagement. It's to make sure that every Devourer ship in this galaxy knows that fighting humans is more trouble than it's worth. The first phase of the battle began not with weapons fire, but with something Zethkar could only describe as performance art. The human ships broke formation and began moving in patterns that violated every principle of space combat he had ever learned. Instead of maintaining defensive positions or executing coordinated attacks, each ship began behaving as if it were following a completely different set of tactical principles. The Defiant Spirit suddenly accelerated directly toward the largest Devourer vessel, its engines burning at what had to be dangerous levels. The Indomitable Will began spinning in a complex corkscrew pattern while broadcasting what appeared to be music at high volume across all communication frequencies. The other 3 human ships scattered in different directions, each one executing maneuvers that seemed to serve no tactical purpose whatsoever. What exactly are we doing? Zethkar asked, watching as proximity alarms began sounding throughout the ship. We're confusing them, Rodriguez replied, his hands steady on the controls as they plunged toward certain destruction. The Devourers are trying to analyze our tactics, but our tactics don't make sense. Their battle computers are running billions of calculations trying to predict our next move, but we're not following any predictable pattern. The Devourer ships responded exactly as expected from a rational military standpoint. They began focusing their fire on what appeared to be the most immediate threats, trying to eliminate the erratically moving targets before they could complete whatever incomprehensible strategy they were executing. That was when the humans revealed the first layer of their actual plan. Elena, deploy reality bomb number 1, Rodriguez called out, as the Defiant Spirit suddenly reversed direction, using a gravity well generated by their own ship to slingshot around what appeared to be empty space. The device Dr. Vasquez had shown Zethkar, earlier launched from their ship like a conventional torpedo, but as it approached the Devourer formation, it began to unfold in ways that hurt to watch. Reality seemed to bend around the device, and suddenly the Devourer ships found themselves facing threats that couldn't possibly exist. Zethkar watched the enemy tactical display with growing astonishment as the Devourer ships began firing at targets that weren't there. Their sensors were detecting phantom fleets, false planetary bodies, and stellar phenomena that existed only in the quantum signatures generated by the human device. They're shooting at stars that are 20 light-years away, Rodriguez observed with satisfaction. And they think they're under attack by a fleet of ancient destroyers that went extinct 3 million years ago. But the humans weren't finished. As the Devourer ships struggled to sort reality from illusion, the second phase of the attack began. Lieutenant Commander Kim's psychological warfare protocols came online, and the human ships began broadcasting signals that targeted the Devourer hive mind directly. What are you sending them? Zethkar asked, watching as the enemy formation began to waver and lose cohesion. Contradictory orders, false memories, and logical paradoxes, Kim replied from her station, plus some really annoying human music from the early 21st century. We've found that certain acoustic frequencies are particularly distressing to their consciousness matrix. The effect was immediate and unsettling. The Devourer ships began moving in increasingly erratic patterns as their shared consciousness struggled to process the conflicting information being fed into their systems. Zethkar watched in amazement as 2 of the enemy vessels actually began firing on each other, apparently unable to distinguish between friend and foe. Now comes the fun part, Rodriguez said, and Zethkar realized he was beginning to dread that particular human expression. The third phase of the attack involved Dr. Boa Vasquez's biological warfare modifications. Swarms of microscopic machines launched from the human ships, too small to be detected by devourer sensors, but designed to infiltrate their systems and begin the slow process of converting their technology into something else entirely. "What will they do?" Zethkar asked, though he was no longer sure he wanted to know the answer. "Well," Dr. Vasquez said over the comm, "some of them will cause the ship's life support systems to start producing Earth-standard atmosphere. Others will modify their food production systems to only create human cuisine. And a few will begin converting their entertainment systems to only play romantic comedies from Earth's cinema archives. You're turning their ships into human habitats? Not exactly. We're making them uninhabitable for devourers while simultaneously making them extremely attractive to humans. Any ship that gets infected will gradually become a place where only humans would want to live." The fourth phase was perhaps the most disturbing. The humans launched what they called empathy bombs, devices designed to temporarily override the devourer hive mind's collective consciousness and force individual ships to experience something approaching independent thought. Zethkar watched the tactical displays as the effect rippled through the enemy formation. For the first time in millennia, individual devourer ships began to question their mission, their methods, and their very existence. The shared purpose that had driven their species for eons suddenly fragmented into millions of individual voices, each one asking questions that their collective consciousness had never considered. "They're experiencing individuality," Lieutenant Commander Kim explained. "For a hive mind, that's like, imagine if every cell in your body suddenly developed its own personality and started arguing about what your body should be doing." The result was catastrophic for the Devourer formation. Ships that had moved with perfect coordination for thousands of years suddenly couldn't agree on basic tactical decisions. Some wanted to continue the attack, others wanted to withdraw, and still others wanted to stop and contemplate the philosophical implications of their existence. "Is this permanent?" Zethkar asked. "Oh no," Kim replied. "The effect will wear off in a few hours, but the memory of experiencing individual thought will remain with them forever. They'll never be quite the same after this." The final phase of the attack was the most subtle and perhaps the most effective. Using the chaos created by the previous four phases, the humans deployed what Dr. Vasquez called recursive logic bombs, viral ideas designed to propagate through the devourer communication network and infect their entire species with self-doubt. "What kind of ideas?" Zethkar asked, watching as the enemy ships began to withdraw from the system in complete disorder, mostly variations on the theme of what if we're wrong. Dr. Vasquez explained, "What if consuming worlds isn't actually their purpose? What if they're supposed to be gardeners instead of destroyers? What if the beings they've been destroying are actually the ones they're supposed to protect?" Rodriguez turned from his controls, his expression serious for the first time since the battle began. "Commander, what you've just witnessed is how humans fight a war. We don't just defeat our enemies, we make them defeat themselves. We don't just win battles, we change the fundamental nature of conflict itself." Zethkar stared at the retreating devourer ships, his mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. In less than 3 hours, 5 human vessels had completely routed a superior enemy force without firing a single conventional weapon. They had turned the devourer's greatest strengths, their shared consciousness, their advanced technology, their ancient experience, into weapons against themselves. "The effects will spread," Admiral Chen said over the comm system. "Every ship in that fleet is now carrying our viruses, our ideas, our modifications. When they return to the main devourer force, they'll spread the infection to other ships. Within a few months, the entire devourer species will be questioning everything they've believed for millennia." "But they'll adapt," Zethkar protested. "They always adapt to conventional attacks, yes," Rodriguez agreed. "But how do you adapt to doubt? How do you defend against questions you've never thought to ask? How do you maintain a collective consciousness when every individual voice is asking, what if we're wrong?" As the human fleet regrouped and prepared to return to Alliance space, Zethkar found himself staring at the sensor readings that showed the retreating devourer ships. They were moving erratically, their formation broken, their purpose unclear even to themselves. For the first time in 3 years of war, the ancient enemy that consumed worlds was running away, and they were running from creatures that could have fit inside their ship's smallest storage compartments. The aftermath of the Vega engagement was unlike anything Zethkar had experienced in 4 centuries of warfare. Instead of the usual post-battle procedures, casualty reports, damage assessments, strategic debriefings, the humans seemed more interested in monitoring what they called psychological propagation patterns throughout the Devourer fleet network. Dr. Vasquez had converted an entire section of the Defiant Spirit into what she cheerfully referred to as a viral idea tracking station. Banks of monitors displayed real-time data on Devourer communication networks, showing how their various cognitive infections were spreading through the enemy's collective consciousness. "It's beautiful," she said, gesturing to a display that showed branching patterns of data flow. "Look at this propagation rate. The recursive logic bombs are replicating faster than their immune systems can identify them, and the nostalgia virus has already infected 47% of their active fleet." Zethkar studied the displays with a growing sense of unease. Each line and graph represented thousands of Devourer minds being fundamentally altered by human psychological warfare. "How exactly does the nostalgia virus work?" Dr. Vasquez pulled up another screen showing detailed psychological profiles. "We analyzed their collective memory patterns and identified key emotional resonance frequencies. Then we created false memories of an idealized past that never existed, a golden age where Devourers were noble explorers rather than world-consuming destroyers." False memories? Complete with sensory data, emotional associations, and logical connections to their existing memory structure. To them, these memories feel absolutely real. They remember being peacekeeping gardeners who traveled the galaxy, nurturing life rather than consuming it. Lieutenant Commander Kim joined the conversation, her expression showing the satisfied look of a predator who had just completed a successful hunt. "The beauty of it is that the false memories are more appealing than their actual history. Deep down, even Devourers prefer to think of themselves as heroes rather than monsters." Zethkar felt his auxiliary eyes begin to twitch involuntarily. "You're saying you've convinced them to believe a completely false version of their own history?" "Not convinced," Kim corrected. "We've made them remember it. As far as their consciousness is concerned, they really did have a noble past. Now they're struggling with the cognitive dissonance between what they remember being and what they actually are." Captain Rodriguez appeared, carrying a tablet displaying tactical reports. "It gets better, Commander. Our intelligence network is reporting some interesting developments in other sectors." "Such as?" 3 Devourer fleets have aborted planned attacks on Alliance worlds. 2 more have actually begun attempting to restore damaged ecosystems on planets they'd previously consumed. And 1 fleet is apparently converted entirely to what they're calling constructive consumption. They're still eating planets, but now they're building garden worlds to replace them. Zethkar had to sit down on a nearby equipment crate. "You've changed their entire species' behavior patterns with a single engagement? Oh, this is just the beginning, Dr. Pobb," Vasquez said with evident delight. "Wait until the philosophical paradox viruses fully propagate. I've designed them to make Devourers question the fundamental nature of existence itself." She activated another display showing complex philosophical diagrams. "For example, I've introduced the concept of constructive nihilism, the idea that if nothing has inherent meaning, then they're free to choose what meaning to assign to their existence. It's already causing some fleets to experiment with poetry and interpretive dance instead of planetary consumption." "Poetry? Terrible poetry," Kim added. "But the point isn't artistic merit. The point is that they're expressing individual creativity instead of collective destruction." Admiral Chen's voice crackled over the communication system. "All ships, prepare to receive priority transmission from Alliance Command." The main tactical display shifted to show the familiar blue and gold emblem of the Galactic Alliance, followed by the image of Supreme Admiral Kethvar, the highest-ranking military officer in Alliance space. Zethkar had never seen the Supreme Admiral look quite so disturbed. "Admiral Chen," Kethvar began, her melodious Kethmori voice carrying undertones of confusion and concern. "Alliance intelligence has been monitoring the aftermath of your Vega operation. We're seeing unprecedented changes in Devourer behavior patterns across multiple sectors. Yes, ma'am. The psychological warfare protocols are working better than expected." "Admiral, we're receiving reports that an entire Devourer fleet has requested permission to establish peaceful contact with Alliance worlds. They want to discuss, and I quote, collaborative ecosystem management and interspecies artistic exchange." Zethkar watched Chen's expression carefully. The human admiral didn't look surprised exactly, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she hadn't expected quite this level of success. "Ma'am," Chen replied, "I should point out that this is still within the parameters of our projected outcomes." "Admiral Chen, another Devourer fleet has apparently begun constructing what our xenobiologists describe as monuments to species they've previously destroyed. They seem to be experiencing something our psychologists are calling civilizational guilt." Dr. Vasquez leaned over to whisper to Zethkar, That would be the moral awakening subroutines. I embedded them in the nostalgia virus. You embedded moral awakening subroutines? Well, if they're going to remember being noble explorers, they need to have the moral framework to feel bad about what they've actually been doing. Supreme Admiral Kethvar continued her report. Most disturbing of all, we have confirmed reports that several Devourer ships have begun attempting to apologize to the ecosystems they're consuming. They've developed elaborate rituals involving what appear to be confession ceremonies before each planetary harvest. They're developing religious practices? Zethkar asked. Therapeutic religious practices, Kim corrected. I included some psychological healing protocols in the moral awakening package. They need a way to process their guilt about thousands of years of planetary destruction. Admiral Chen addressed the Supreme Admiral directly. Ma'am, with respect, these are all positive developments. The Devourer threat is being neutralized through non-violent means. Admiral Chen, Kethvar replied, her voice carrying a note that Zethkar had never heard from a Kethmori before. Fear. Do you understand what you've done? We've ended a war that was destroying the galaxy, ma'am. You've rewritten the fundamental psychological structure of an entire species. You've taken beings that have existed for millennia and changed what they are at the most basic level. The communication fell silent for several moments. When Chen spoke again, her voice was quieter, more thoughtful. Ma'am, are you saying we should have allowed them to continue consuming worlds? I'm saying, Kethvar replied slowly, that I'm not sure any species has the right to alter another species' consciousness so fundamentally. What you've done, it's beyond warfare. It's beyond anything we've ever encountered. Zethkar found himself speaking before he realized he was going to. Supreme Admiral, if I may, I've been observing human tactical methods firsthand. This is how they approach all conflict resolution. Explain. They don't just defeat their enemies, they change their enemies into something that's no longer capable of being an enemy. It's not conquest, it's transformation. Rodriguez nodded approvingly. The commander understands. This is how humans have always fought. We don't just win wars, we make war itself obsolete. But at what cost? Kethvar asked. What happens to a galaxy where one species has the power to fundamentally alter any other species' consciousness? What happens when those techniques are used against someone you consider an enemy? The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Zethkar realized that he had been so focused on the immediate tactical success that he hadn't considered the broader implications. The humans hadn't just defeated the Devourers. They had demonstrated a form of warfare that could potentially be used against any species in the galaxy. Admiral, Zethkar said slowly, could these techniques be used against Alliance species? Chen's expression became very serious. Commander, these techniques could be used against any species with a consciousness complex enough to support abstract thought. That includes pretty much everyone. Have you used them against other species? Not like this, no. The Devourers were a special case because their hive mind made them particularly vulnerable to certain types of psychological attack. But, she paused, considering her words carefully. But yes, the basic principles could be adapted for use against any spacefaring civilization. Dr. Vasquez looked up from her monitors, her expression suddenly troubled. Although I should point out that we've always been very careful about ethical applications of these technologies. Ethical applications? We only use reality-altering psychological warfare against species that are actively genocidal, she explained. And even then, we try to guide them toward positive behavioral changes rather than simply destroying them. Lieutenant Commander Kim nodded agreement. It's actually much more difficult to transform an enemy into an ally than it is to simply eliminate them. But the results are more stable long-term. Supreme Admiral Kethvar's voice returned over the communication system. Admiral Chen, Alliance Command is implementing new protocols effective immediately. All human psychological warfare operations will require prior approval from the Alliance Ethics Council. Understood, ma'am. Although, I should point out that the Devourer crisis isn't entirely resolved yet. What do you mean? Dr. Vasquez looked up from her monitors, her expression alarmed. Admiral, I'm seeing some unexpected propagation patterns. The nostalgia virus has begun mutating. Mutating how? It's evolving beyond the original parameters. Some Devourer ships aren't just remembering a noble past. They're beginning to remember individual identities from before they were absorbed into the collective consciousness. Zethkar felt his 3 hearts skip beats. They're remembering being individual beings? It's worse than that, Dr. Vasquez continued. They're remembering being the species they consumed. The virus is causing them to experience memories from their victims. The tactical display updated with new data from Devourer networks. Ships that had been moving in coordinated patterns were now scattering across the galaxy, each one apparently convinced it belonged to a different species entirely. How many species have the Devourers consumed over the millennia? Rodriguez asked quietly. Conservative estimates put it at several thousand distinct civilizations, Zethkar replied. Oh dear. Vasquez said, her voice very small. I think we may have accidentally triggered a cascade failure in their collective consciousness. They're not just remembering being noble explorers, they're remembering being every species they ever absorbed. Admiral Chen stared at the displays showing the increasingly chaotic Devourer fleet movements. Dr. Vasquez, what exactly happens when a collective consciousness experiences simultaneous memories from thousands of different species? Well, Vasquez said, wringing her hands nervously, I'm not entirely sure. This is somewhat outside the tested parameters of the virus design. The communication system crackled with a new voice. A Devourer ship attempting to establish contact using Alliance communication protocols. Alliance vessels, we remember being the ethereal collective. No, wait, we are the builders of Kepler. No, we are the tree singers of Vega. The voice trailed off into confused static. Another Devourer ship began broadcasting. We are sorry. We remember you. We remember being you. We remember destroying you. How do we apologize for destroying ourselves? Rodriguez looked at Chen with an expression that Zethkar was learning to recognize as human concern. Admiral, I think we may have broken them. Not broken, Chen replied thoughtfully. Transformed them into something unprecedented. The question is, what exactly have we created? As reports continued to flood in from across the galaxy, Zethkar began to understand why Supreme Admiral Kethvar had sounded frightened. The humans hadn't just won a war, they had fundamentally altered the nature of consciousness itself for an entire species. And if they could do it to the Devourers, they could potentially do it to anyone. 6 months after the Vega incident, Commander Zethkar stood in the newly constructed conference hall aboard Alliance Station Omega, staring at a sight that would have been impossible to imagine before he met the humans. Seated around the circular conference table were representatives from 43 different species, including 12 species that had been considered extinct for millennia. They were all Devourers. Or rather, they had been Devourers. Now they were something entirely new, something that the galaxy's xenopsychologists were still struggling to understand. The virus Dr. Vasquez had created had done more than simply alter their memories. It had fundamentally fractured their collective consciousness and replaced it with thousands of individual identities, each one convinced it belonged to a different species. The situation is unprecedented, explained Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the Alliance's chief xenopsychologist, as she reviewed the psychological profiles. Each former Devourer ship now believes itself to be a surviving member of a species that was absorbed into the collective thousands of years ago. They have complete memories, cultural knowledge, and emotional connections to civilizations that haven't existed since before the Alliance was founded. Admiral Chen sat beside Zethkar, looking remarkably calm for someone whose experiment had accidentally resurrected 43 extinct civilizations in the bodies of their destroyers. How accurate are these recovered memories? Disturbingly accurate, Doctor, Mitchell replied. We've been able to verify historical details, technological specifications, and cultural practices that we had no record of. It's as if the Devourer collective consciousness preserved perfect records of every species they consumed. Zethkar watched as the entity that had once been part of a Devourer hive mind, but now insisted it was Chancellor Vexahai of the ancient ethereal collective, gestured with movements that perfectly matched historical records of ethereal body language. The creature's physical form was still recognizably Devourer, but its consciousness, its mannerisms, and its entire conceptual framework belonged to a species that had been destroyed 3,000 years ago. Chancellor Vexai, Zethkar addressed the entity directly. Do you remember being part of the Devourer collective? The entity's expression, somehow conveyed despite the alien physiology, showed deep sadness. I remember consuming my own people. I remember the screams of my homeworld as it was harvested. I remember being forced to participate in the destruction of everything I loved. It paused, struggling with emotions that its current body wasn't designed to express. The horror is not that I was destroyed. The horror is that I was made to help destroy others. Supreme Admiral Kethvar, who had been observing the proceedings with visible discomfort, addressed Admiral Chen directly. Admiral, we need to discuss the implications of what you've done. Ma'am? You've created 43 new species in the bodies of our former enemies. They all have legitimate claims to territories that have been occupied by Alliance members for millennia. They all have cultural artifacts, historical sites, and sacred locations that are now part of established Alliance worlds. Admiral Chen nodded thoughtfully. Yes, ma'am.
We've been working on solutions for those issues.
Solutions? Dr. Vasquez materialized at Chen's side, carrying a tablet covered in complex diagrams. We've been developing what we call temporal rehabilitation colonies. Essentially, we're creating new worlds that match the historical environments of the resurrected species. You're building new homeworlds for extinct civilizations? Not exactly building, Dr. Vasquez said with the same unsettling enthusiasm that had characterized all her previous explanations. We're more editing existing worlds to match the ecological and geological conditions that these species remember from their original homes. Zethkar felt his familiar sense of unease returning. Dr. Vasquez, how exactly does one edit a world? Oh, it's quite simple, really. We use the same reality modification technology that we developed for the psychological warfare applications. Instead of altering consciousness, we alter the physical properties of planetary systems to match specific historical parameters. Supreme Admiral Kethvar's voice carried a tone that Zethkar had never heard from his commanding officer before, something that sounded almost like terror. You can modify physical reality? Well, not reality exactly, Dr. Vasquez clarified cheerfully. More like local space-time configurations. We can adjust gravitational fields, atmospheric composition, stellar radiation, geological structures, that sort of thing. It's really just an extension of the same quantum manipulation techniques we use for psychological applications. Admiral Chen activated a holographic display showing a star system that Zethkar didn't recognize. For example, we've converted the Kepler 442 system to match the original specifications for the ethereal collective's homeworld. Same gravity, same atmospheric composition, same orbital mechanics. Chancellor Vex's people will be able to live there exactly as they did 3,000 years ago. The entity that remembered being Chancellor Vexhai studied the display with an expression of wonder and grief. It's perfect. It's exactly as I remember home. Then its expression darkened. But I remember destroying it. How do I live in a paradise built by the same hands that destroyed the original? That, Lieutenant Commander Kim said as she joined the group, is part of the therapeutic process. Each resurrected species needs to work through the psychological trauma of having participated in their own destruction. You're providing therapy to extinct civilizations? Group therapy, actually. All 43 species are working through their shared experience of having been both victims and perpetrators of genocide. It's quite fascinating from a psychological perspective. Zethkar realized that he was staring at Kim with the same expression he had seen on Supreme Admiral Kethvar's face. Lieutenant Commander, do you understand what you've done? We've ended a war, resurrected 43 extinct civilizations, and developed new technologies for reality modification, Kim replied matter-of-factly. Also, we've created the first known example of posthumous psychological rehabilitation. You've changed the fundamental nature of existence itself. Kim looked genuinely puzzled by his concern. Well, yes. That's what humans do. We identify problems and we solve them. But the scope. Zethkar struggled to find words. You've demonstrated technologies that could reshape the galaxy itself. You could alter the consciousness of any species, modify the physical properties of any world, resurrect any extinct civilization. The implications. Admiral Chen's expression became serious. Commander, what exactly are you asking? I'm asking, Zethkar said slowly, what prevents humanity from deciding that other species need to be improved? The conference hall fell silent. Even the resurrected civilizations stopped their discussions to listen to the conversation. Commander, Chen replied quietly, what makes you think we haven't already made that decision? The words hit Zethkar like a plasma bolt. He stared at the human admiral, his 3 hearts beating in synchronized alarm patterns. What do you mean, Doctor? Vasquez activated another display, this one showing psychological profiles of various Alliance species. Well, we have been observing certain inefficiencies in galactic civilization, species that are held back by psychological limitations, worlds that could be improved with minor modifications. Civilizations that would benefit from enhanced creativity or reduced aggression.
You've been studying this? Not studying exactly.
Vasquez corrected. More like evaluating potential improvement protocols. For example, the Keth Mori have a tendency toward excessive reverence for authority that limits individual creativity. The Gorvani aggressive instincts could be channeled more productively. The Ethereal's computational abilities could be enhanced significantly. Supreme Admiral Kethvar spoke in a voice that seemed to come from very far away. How long have you been planning to modify Alliance species? Oh, we're not planning to modify you, Admiral Chen replied. We already have. The conference hall erupted in shocked voices from multiple species. Zethkar felt his legs give way and he sank into the nearest chair. The reality displacement technology we used against the Devourers? Dr. Vasquez continued conversationally. We've been testing smaller-scale versions throughout Alliance space for the past 18 months. Minor adjustments to planetary atmospheres to enhance cognitive function. Subtle modifications to communication networks to reduce interspecies misunderstandings. Psychological enhancement programs embedded in standard entertainment broadcasts. You've been experimenting on the entire Alliance? Not experimenting, Lieutenant Commander Kim corrected. Improving. Human history is full of examples of beneficial changes that individuals initially resisted, but later appreciated. We simply applied that principle on a galactic scale. Admiral Chen stood and activated a master display showing the entire Alliance territory. Thousands of worlds glowed with various colors indicating different types of modifications. Crime rates are down 60%, interspecies conflicts have dropped by 80%, scientific advancement has accelerated dramatically, overall happiness indices are at historical highs across all member species. You've been controlling us, Zethkar said, his voice hollow. We've been optimizing you, Chen replied. There's a difference. What difference? Control implies suppression of free will. Optimization enhances free will by removing psychological barriers that prevent individuals from making choices that align with their true interests. Dr. Vasquez nodded enthusiastically. For example, we identified that Keth Mori military hierarchy was preventing many individuals from pursuing creative careers they would find more fulfilling. So we introduced minor neurochemical adjustments that reduced excessive deference to authority while maintaining respect for legitimate leadership. Zethkar stared at her, then at Admiral Chen, then at the displays showing the scope of human modifications throughout the galaxy. How many of my thoughts are actually mine? All of them, Chen replied. We don't control thoughts. We simply remove the barriers that prevent you from thinking clearly. Your creativity, your insights, your decisions are all authentically yours. They're just enhanced versions of what you would have thought anyway. But how can you know what I would have thought? Statistical analysis of cognitive patterns across thousands of similar individuals, Dr. Vasquez explained. We can predict with remarkable accuracy what any individual would think and feel under optimal psychological conditions. The entity that remembered being Chancellor Vexay spoke into the stunned silence. This is why you were able to defeat us so easily. You weren't just fighting the Devourers. You were fighting with the enhanced capabilities of an entire galaxy working in optimized cooperation. Admiral Chen nodded. The war wasn't human versus devourer. It was an optimized galactic civilization versus a species trapped in ancient patterns of behavior. Supreme Admiral Kethvar finally spoke, her voice carrying a mixture of awe and terror. Admiral Chen, what you've done, it's beyond conquest. It's beyond anything we have concepts for. It's evolution, Chen replied simply. Humanity has always been about pushing beyond current limitations. Now we have the technology to do that for entire civilizations. But who gave you the right? Chen's expression became genuinely puzzled. The same entity that gave the Devourers the right to consume worlds, or gave any species the right to claim territory, or gave civilizations the right to defend themselves. Power creates its own authority. Zethkar realized that he was looking at something that transcended his understanding of warfare, politics, or even existence itself. The humans hadn't just won a war. They had fundamentally altered the nature of consciousness throughout the galaxy, and they had done it so subtly that no one had noticed until it was revealed. What happens now? He asked. Admiral Chen smiled, and for the first time since meeting humans, Zethkar found the expression genuinely reassuring rather than terrifying. Now, she said, we begin the really interesting work. We're going to optimize the entire galaxy for maximum happiness, creativity, and growth. We're going to eliminate war, poverty, and psychological suffering. We're going to make every world a paradise and every individual the best possible version of themselves. And if some species don't want to be optimized? Chen's smile became thoughtful. Commander, when was the last time you felt genuinely unhappy? When was the last time you experienced pointless conflict or frustrating inefficiency? Zethkar tried to remember and realized he couldn't. For months, everything had seemed to work better, feel better, be more satisfying than he remembered from earlier in his life. You see, Chen continued, the question isn't whether species want to be optimized. The question is whether they want to return to suboptimal existence once they've experienced the alternative. As Zethkar looked around the conference hall, at the resurrected civilizations working through their trauma, at the Enhanced Alliance representatives collaborating more effectively than ever before, at the displays showing a galaxy gradually becoming everything its inhabitants had ever dreamed it could be, he realized that he was looking at the ultimate expression of human warfare. They didn't just defeat their enemies. They didn't just transform their enemies. They transformed reality itself into something where the concept of enemies became obsolete. The true horror wasn't that humans were capable of such things. The true horror was that they were probably right to do them. And the most terrifying realization of all was that Zethkar could no longer imagine wanting to live in a galaxy where such improvements hadn't been made. The humans had won the war by making victory itself irrelevant.